Hi, everyone, and welcome to another interview from Change the Air Foundation. Today, I'm very excited to speak with our guest, Michael Rubino, who is co-founder and president of Change the Air Foundation. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Kendra.
I'm so excited that you're here. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Today, we're going to have some really helpful information. We're going to cover what we need to know if you're thinking about remediating your home or building. For water damage and mold, we're going to talk about where things go right, where things go wrong, and how you can ensure the best possible outcome for you and your family. So I'm excited to just dive right in if that's all right with you.
All right with me. Let's do it.
Okay. So if someone sees or suspects mold or water damage, why might their first call be to an indoor environmental professional as opposed to a mold remediator?
Well, I think you'd want to call an indoor environmental professional first, right? Because you want to have inconclusive data as to where the problem is. So you can actually build an action plan, a strategy to remediate. Because if you just call a remediator first and they don't have any data to operate off of, I know for me, like if you called me as a remediator and said, "Hey, I think I have mold in my home," I probably would refer you to an IEP right away. I wouldn't work with you at all at that stage because all remediation should be off of data. Now, of course, this is an evolution of remediation because for so long, people just opened stuff up because they saw some water damage. And I think it was more done on a cosmetic basis. But as we know today, much more than we ever had before, how much this impacts our health, it's really important to treat this as a science project rather than, your cookie cutter construction project.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important and something I know in my journey. I went through several remediations before I even learned about the role of an IEP and a role of data and how important that is. So I guess here's a question I see all the time. Why can't you just kill mold? I can go to the store, I can get that bottle of bleach. Why is that not a good idea?
Well, I mean, there's many different reasons, right? So for one, trying to kill mold, you could accidentally trigger mold self-defense mechanism and start producing mycotoxins, which is not something you want in abundance in your environment. That's reason. That's a reason. Another reason is if you just kill it, it's very likely to come back. Mainly because killing it doesn't address whatever opportunity allowed mold to grow in the first place. Three, what happens when you kill anything, right? You leave behind all these particles. So it's just kind of like when you go outside and kill a weed, the weeds come right back. Why is that? Because the roots are still there. There's still seeds that have been created as long as that weed was alive. So you're going to get more weeds. You have to do a conclusive job of, a finite job of removing mold. And so that whole archaic way of trying to kill things is not how we do things here.
Yeah. So put down the bleach for anyone who's listening. Just resist the temptation to go in there and start cleaning. We're going to do more harm than good for sure, it sounds like.
Yes.
So one of my questions, and I know I had this early on and I hear it all the time. What does it really take to become a mold remediator? And why are there so many inconsistencies? Are there minimum certifications or training organizations or standards? It's kind of like the wild, wild west out there. Can you help us understand this a little bit more?
So I got my mold remediation certification in 3 days. I knew a lot more than the average person at this time because I was around construction my entire life. But just for anybody, I mean, I can own a Verizon wireless store one day and become a mold remediator in 3 days after that, right? So that's part of the problem, that there's not really proper training and procedures in place. There's also a lack of standards. So it takes someone really understanding the science behind mold growing in our homes, bacteria thriving in our homes. This actually is microbiology at its finest here. And I think if you don't have an understanding of that, 3-day class or not, you're likely to put people in harm's way. So to find a good remediator, you want someone who has a burning desire to help people, who's going to go above and beyond whatever standards, because there really are none, to make sure that they're doing things correctly and trying to fix your home in the right way.
Yeah, so it's really up to the homeowner, right, to do their due diligence, vet these people, make calls, get quotes, and ask some of those questions. So we're going to get into that a little bit more in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to know, what are some of the basic remediation steps like containment, air pressure, demolition, et cetera, because this seems to be where it goes wrong or where there's so many inconsistencies. Can you walk us through in a little bit more detail what we should be looking for?
Yeah, step one is containment and protection, and engineering controls. It's important for people to understand that containment is actually the secondary barrier. The actual importance of containment is creating smaller areas inside the areas we're working in, so that when you have engineering controls in place, like an air scrubber under negative pressure, as an example, there's less volume of air that it has to pull from, so that you get a true negative pressure. It's a lot easier to create negative pressure in a smaller space than it is in a 250 square foot living room, for example. So you want to utilize the containment to create basically microclimates inside of each area, so that you know for sure that that area is under negative pressure. Obviously, there's ways to test negative pressure visually. You should see the plastic bowing inwards towards the location. There are smoke tests that you can do with these like false smoke sticks, to make sure that the smoke is blowing in the direction of the machine and it's not escaping out in other places. There's a lot of different ways to test it. But the bottom line is, I think for most remediation companies, they don't train their staff well on understanding engineering controls and pressurization. And for people that are listening, it's not all about the plastic. A lot of people think it's the plastic is what stops the mold. It's not the plastic. It's actually the equipment that stops the mold from traveling from one area to the other. So, I've seen, people have come to me when the plastic has fell down overnight or something like that. Is my house ruined? Not if they weren't working when the plastic fell down and they had the engineering controls set up. So it gives people a little peace of mind. But just knowing that fact, I mean, I've also heard the opposite side of the spectrum. They set up plastic. There was no engineering controls in place. There's no air scrubbers in place. Am I safe? Probably not, right? They probably have spread that, because as you're opening up walls, you're creating more air exchange between interstitial cavities and the workplace. So without those engineering controls, you're really not, it's not ideal.
So once you have the containment set up and they have the proper pressure established, what happens next?
So next you would start, well, first off, to kind of go back a bit in that engineering stage, you want to protect things. You want to protect the floor. You're going to be removing building materials. You want to make sure you're protecting the floor. You'll want to protect ingress and egress pathways. So for example, if you have to move from a bedroom through a hallway, you also want to protect that bedroom as you may be entering in and out of the space. Especially for those listening who may be trying to do some stuff on their own. It's really important that you protect your space. Use things like, rosin paper and ram board, things that you can easily pick up, clean underneath them afterwards and discard. But you want to protect the space so that you're not causing further damage, because this is kind of a construction site mixed with a science project. And that's how people have to kind of understand that.
How do you protect your crew inside this space? They do this day in and day out. How do you ensure that they're healthy?
So our crew has what's called PAPRs, again, way over the top for what we're doing. We look like we're about to save the world from AIDS when we enter your home. But you want to have PPE. So you have N95s with P100 combination filter cartridges, which will help against organic vapors and particulate, which is particularly good for dealing with mold and mycotoxins. And I think that's really important to have those types of protection. You want to wear Tyvek suits inside because you don't want to transfer things onto your clothes and then bring them home with you. Even if you're working on your own home, odds are you might be staying elsewhere. You don't want to take that back to your rental property where your family and kids may be. So it's important to wear that. We also do nitrile gloves. We tape seal those to the Tyvek suit as well. You want to wear booties too. And it's important to remember that all that stuff should stay on inside the containment. You shouldn't bring it outside the containment because then you're bringing that with you outside the containment. So you should, in theory, never really see people with suits outside the work areas.
Good to know. But inside, it sounds like it's a little bit like a scene from ET or something.
Yes.
Looks very overwhelming.
And That's the way we protect ourselves from these smaller particles. And it's not, everything is 99%, right? So it's never, unfortunately, nothing's ever 100%. PAPRs are definitely closer to that range just because they're full hoods. But unfortunately, you're dealing with microbiology. There's fragments that are smaller than what the filters can pass. And so you do the best that you can. But of course, there's always some risk and danger. So if you're highly, highly sensitive to mold, even with a mask, you're not really 100% safe.
Okay, so you have these guys, they're all decked out. You have the environment protected with containment and the right pressure. Now it comes time to remove the mold. And this is where you see a lot of options out there. What are we looking for in a remediation contract so that we know that how the mold is actually being removed and whatever else may be growing there is done so effectively and safely?
So really simple analogy for you here. So if anyone who's ever pulled a weed before, you have to pull the weed and get the roots out, right? Mold has roots too. So it's important that you're actually abrasively removing mold from the structure that's going to stay behind. You can do that by sanding, wire brushing. Hydrogen peroxide has been known to help remove roots and float them to the surface. You can wipe it. I mean, there's many different ways to do it. The thing is, you want to actually employ some sort of technology or modality that will remove the roots. Otherwise, roots are still there. It'll definitely come back. It's only a matter of time. So that's really important. I think that's a step that's often missed. A lot of people are going towards like fogging technologies because it's cheaper and it sounds great. But just remember that without removing those roots, it's very, very likely to come back.
So what's your position on the use of harsh chemicals or paints or encapsulates as part of the remediation process?
My stance on harsh chemicals is just not necessary. And I think that's kind of where we're at. I mean, I don't see any value of using a harsh chemical versus using a botanical product. Maybe the botanical product costs, a little bit more per gallon, but I think versus like what we're exposed to in our health, it's well worth the investment. We don't use any harsh chemicals whatsoever in our process for that very reason, just because it's not needed. And why put people in harm's way when you don't need to? With regards to encapsulant, encapsulant's a preventative measure. So it's not utilized to remediate, it's utilized to help prevent, future mold growth in that area. It's going to help with, maybe you're encapsulating an attic, you're helping to slow the vapor diffusion down of humidity, which is a good idea. Maybe you're doing it on a wall that is, I don't know, a structural wall that you can't remove, that you want to, seal and make sure that it's less prone to microbial growth. Those are good ideas, but it's not an in place of, right? So you still have to remove the mold. You still have to do it. It's important to remember that that's a preventative action and it's not actually a remedial action. So for those who think you can just paint over it, unfortunately you cannot.
Okay, that's good to know. So after removal, what is that final step? Because I know sometimes people think, well, I'm done, I removed it, but there's some cleaning involved here, correct? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so let's go back to organism microbiology 101
Love
here.
it.
So we have an organism and we have particles. All life as we know it starts off as some sort of seed, right? And it grows into a full-blown organism. With mold, similar to plants, seed versus a spore, but the ideology is the same. That spore, when it's met with water, has an opportunity to grow. It becomes a full-blown organism, just like a seed becomes a plant when it's got water and it roots into the soil. The difference is mold can just root into our homes, right? So that's where we want to be careful about mold, whereas we are a little freer with our plants and plant life. When it comes to mold growing inside of our home, once it becomes a full-blown organism, it then reproduces, right? Just like as a plant becomes a full-blown plant, it starts to produce seeds, it pollinates, right? We get more plants. Well, with mold, obviously its reproduction can be catastrophic because not only will it reproduce across the home, wherever there's a wet environment, it also gets inside the body. And so we want to make sure that we're cleaning up these particles so that we're creating less opportunity for exposure for ourselves health-wise, and also less opportunity for mold to begin to grow in other parts of our home. And we do that by cleaning. And the reason being is because when you have these organisms in our homes, and they're reproducing, they aerosolize, right? That's why it led to believe many years ago that air testing was the gold standard to find these problems. We can talk about that as much or as little as you'd like. But we have these aerosolization of particles, and then these particles eventually settle, right? They are heavier than air. They are going to eventually settle. And that's exactly what they do. They fall to the floor and they become part of our dust. And for those that don't know, the dust does recirculate, it does enter our breathing zone and enter our body. So with testing, air testing, exclusively just air testing, you're going to miss a lot of problems because you're only testing the air in a snapshot in time. And you're not taking into account a lot of the variables where these particles do re-aerosolize once they're settled on the floor, walls, shelves, etc., and then enter our breathing zone. And that's what we see a lot in this industry is kind of that missed point there.
Can you tell us a little bit about the role that your HVAC and duct system plays in all of this, and how you might factor that into your overall project?
Sure. An HVAC is basically the lungs of the home, especially if you're dealing with central air conditioning systems. They draw air through what's called a return. They condition it, depending on if you have AC or heat on. It's going to either condition it and make it hotter or condition it and make it colder. We're most interested in we're interested in both just because of temperature differentials, but we're most interested in the AC unit, mainly because it's what's called a coil that basically pulls the moisture out of the air, conditions it, and that condensation drains down into that coil into what's called a drip pan. I'm sure anyone has heard of a drip pan before when it comes to the HVAC. That drip pan then has a PVC line that typically is supposed to be sloped. Not all of them are, unfortunately, outside so that water drains outside of our home. And if you were to look up at your home somewhere around the way, you'd find this drain line going somewhere. Sometimes in the gutter, sometimes it's outside the exterior facade, but you'll always see this PVC pipe sticking out, and that's where the HVAC drains. When we circle back to that AC coil that constantly condensates, condensation obviously is moisture, right? So it's a wet environment. Most of our homes do not have proper filtration to filter out a particle as small as mold. So what happens is that as mold becomes abundant in our environment, it creates more opportunity for that mold to be in the air drawn into the HVAC system. Then there's more opportunity for that mold to wind up on the coil and then start to grow from a spore into a full-blown mold organism again, right? And if you know about mold, they reproduce and then they colonize together. So what happens is we have one lone spore that gets into the coil, starts to grow. That one lone spore becomes 100,000 spores very quickly. And now our HVAC system, which is the lungs of our home, is sick. And it's actually like a mold factory at that point, pumping more and more particles, could be toxins as well, that into the air that we're conditioning and breathing in. So that's another way that mold obviously becomes a problem in our home, but it also is a way for mold in our bedroom to be drawn in and recirculated to other parts of our home more easily. So I think the HVAC system plays an important role. I would say I don't know in the 10 years that I've been doing this if I've seen one home that didn't have a mold problem that also didn't have mold in their HVAC. So I think that HVAC systems, in order to solve this problem for the future of our civilization, I think we're going to need to be a little bit more creative on our HVAC systems.
Is that you bring up an interesting point. Is there anything that we can consider in the meantime, either a better filter, or I've seen certain UV lights you can install? Can you talk to us a little bit about prevention or maintenance in general that might be smart for people to consider?
Yeah, so without naming any products by name,
Yes.
there are products that, for MERV 16 filter, MERV 16 filters, that's the highest MERV rating you can get in this current technology, that will get particle sizes a lot smaller than mold. Some of them even can filter out particles as small as viruses, which if you don't know is very, very tiny, one of the smallest organisms in our microbiological system, at least that we know about anyway.
Sure.
And so if we filter our HVAC systems and remove these small particles from getting into our system in the first place, we're going to be far better off for that. UV lights, UV light technology, just like the sun, has been known to prevent microbial growth. I mean, I've seen some studies where it can kill some things, but it brings us back to that whole, we're not trying to kill anything, we're trying to remove it. I think that UV light, when used as a prevention tool to prevent microbial growth on a particular substrate. So for example, you have that UV light shining on the coil. I think that's helpful. It's not foolproof. I've still seen UV lights in systems that had mold in it. So I think it's when it's paired up with filtration, it could be very effective. But again, we want to, filtration, I think, is more important because you're stopping those particles from getting in the first place.
I'm going to go check to see if I have a MERV 16 in my filter when we're done. In general, what makes remediation successful, and why does it seem like it so often fails, I guess, for lack of a better term?
Well, it all stems with the data. So I think if remediation is to be successful, it has to have good data to start with. And by that, I mean, we need to know where the sources of microbial growth are, whether it's bacteria or mold. We need to understand where those areas are. Just because we've had water in our home doesn't always mean that that's the exact thing. I've seen water damage that looked like it was no big deal that ended up being 100,000 spores of mold. And then I've seen, things that looked like a big deal that ended up drying fast enough. There was no microbial growth there. So it's very hard to depict what exactly needs to be done. And that's why I think laboratory data is so important in this process. Because again, money doesn't grow on trees. We all have limited budgets to, fix our homes. And so we need to actually have that data to know how we're going to make the most impact with the money that we do have. So I think that's really important. There's a good story I can tell you about a client that we had some mold in her attic and basement. She was under the impression that because her bedroom was located right below the attic, that she should do the attic. And then when I looked at the lab data, the basement was causing way more contamination than the attic was. And so after the phone call and talking her through things, we decided to go with the basement over the attic because she didn't have money to do both, right? And so we had to figure out what was going to make the most impact for her. And so I think laboratory data is really important. I also knew that because air rises, most times throughout the year, you're going to have a lot more impact in the living spaces, especially being on the second floor right below the attic. So it was a project that it was dictated by the data. And I think that, if you are wondering what to do with your house, you will stop wondering when you see how worse off certain areas are than others. It'll become more clear to you which you should prioritize.
That is a perfect segue into my next question, which is what role does pre and post testing play in a remediation project?
So pre-testing gets you the data so you understand what you should be doing. Post-testing gets you the data to understand if you did the work, if you went far enough, I should say. So for example, the typical industry is cut 2 feet beyond wherever you saw signs of water damage, mold, et cetera. And sometimes 2 feet's not enough. And so maybe you start with 2 feet because you don't want to take the whole wall, because then that's more wall you have to put back, right? There's always a reason to why things are limited. But you want to make sure that you went far enough. And so post-testing verifies if you did or did not. There are many situations where, post-testing told us that we needed to go another couple feet, that there was still something there. And I think that's why it adds a lot of value to the table, because, sometimes you're dealing with things you can't see. In this particular scenario, it looked like the water had stopped. It didn't look like the water kept going, but mold's roots can grow for a few feet. If any of you have ever seen this video on Science Direct, it's like, should I eat the moldy, could I cut the moldy part of the bread off? Anyone who hasn't seen that should watch that video. It's actually really cool. It's an animated video, and it explains how the moldy part of the bread is where the mold is colonized for sure, but then the roots extend, throughout the rest of the bread. And so you're still consuming mold, even if you cut off that moldy part of the bread. So that depiction was really helpful. And then we actually show it to a lot of our guys so they can kind of really fully understand this. But it can go further than what the eye can see. And so that's why post-testing is really important to catch that, because we don't have x-ray vision. We can't see that. None of us do. So it's important to verify that you did go far enough.
For those in the US, mold remediation is not well regulated. There aren't any permissible exposure limits. So can you tell us for this post remediation verification, what should people be looking for in terms of cutoffs, or what's a pass or what's a fail? Are there red flag molds or zero tolerance molds that just kind of clarify for you a little further if it worked or if it didn't?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say because there's a lot of different variables in how one would test. But let's just say you're remediating an attic and you're looking at air and surface samples of the attic. If you're still catching, chitomium or Stachybotrys on a surface sample, that tells me that the space still needs to be cleaned again. Maybe that you had some particles aerosolized from the remediation and they're still settling down. That can happen. It just needs to be cleaned again. It also could be an indicator that there's a room below the attic somewhere that may have had water damage that needs to be identified and remediated too, which can happen also, especially if that water traveled down on an exterior wall where the eaves are. You may not get good visibility to see downward, and you may have, some mold growing on that corner. So it's always important to look at the data and try to understand and assess what's happened. And you really need people that are experienced, that have done this, that have troubleshooted some of these issues. Because I think if you don't, you're likely to get someone who says, it's just one spore, it's fine. But it may not be fine, right? And there may still be a problem there that just wasn't addressed because it's hard to find sometimes. But I think you have to really, be diligent when it comes to that kind of stuff. As far as air sampling in an attic, just to keep the example pretty similar, you typically are going to have some sort of air infiltration from outside, soffit vents and ridge vents. So you want to make sure that if it's more elevated than outside, that would be very odd, because should be, after the space was remediated, that the only mold coming in is the mold that's already outside. And so in an air test should be, either less than outside or very similar, should not be more elevated. That means there's something else contributing to it. And then as far as, people worried about like mold coming in from outside and recontaminating their whole house, most attics, again, if they're well ventilated, the air is going to come in and then push right back up out through the ridge vent or out through, one of those power vents, gable vents. We have some sort of cross breeze here in some capacity, depending on how the attic's ventilated. So you don't need to necessarily worry about like recontaminating your whole house. We're not looking to build a bubble around your house either. So there's we don't need no mold. What we need our house not reproducing mold at an accelerated rate that makes the air that we're breathing and the exposure that's coming into contact with our body highly elevated or abnormal. There are no standards of acceptability, if you will, of what they should be. So it's really dependent upon the IEP that you hire. And so I think it's important to interview the IEP and get a really good understanding of what they consider, what they're looking for, and make sure that your views match with theirs, because they're kind of the referee of, clearing the project, if you will. So I think it's really important that you do a lot of due diligence in the IEP that you hire and the remediator that you hire, and make sure that everyone is on the same page of what is achievable and what is not, because I think a lot of upset comes out of that confusion. Or maybe somebody says something like, yeah, we're going to get this place perfect. And then, they realize that perfection is not obtainable necessarily. And so halfway through at the results call, they're like, well, it's better than outside and that's the best we can do. And then as the person, it leaves you feeling like hopeless that you didn't get it all and you didn't find it. So I think it's really important to have like a really good, honest and educated conversation up front about what can my team guarantee me? What am I going to get out of this process? And that'll help you kind of narrow down who you want to work with also.
Yeah, that relationship between the homeowner, the IEP, remediator is really crucial. And we were fortunate enough, we had Brian Carr on. So if you're listening, go find that episode about what that looks like to hire an indoor environmental professional to help, because it really is important to have all that agreed upon prior to the work starting. One of the things we sometimes see is people struggle, they don't own the home, so they have a lot less control. So, how might a renter approach a remediation situation differently, given the different circumstance?
There's a lot different. First off, if you're a renter, I mean, there's just various different things that you're trying to accomplish, I would imagine.
Mhm.
I rent right now. I had some mold in my HVAC in my rental. My landlord was gracious enough to listen to me and replace everything. So not everyone gets that lucky. I totally recognize that. I think there's a couple of different strategies, right? You're either looking for them to make the repairs properly so you could stay there. I think that's always the ideal scenario. That's going to depend on the type of landlord that you have, how good of a person they are, how willing they are to listen and protect their investment. You have option two, which is this landlord is not going to do things properly, so I need to break my lease. And depending on which of those options you're looking for, it's going to really determine the process. I think number one, no matter which option that you pick, you should hire the IEP because it's your space. You may not own the property, but you actually care more about the outcome of the work than anyone else. The landlord's not living there. They don't care unless they care enough to protect their investment. So at the end of the day, you hiring the IEP is going to be the most valuable thing. Depending on which state you live in, you may have laws that protect you so that you can get reimbursement for that investment. But irregardless, and I understand a lot of people are struggling out there and may not have the money to do an inspection. I think you need to highly, figure out how to do it though, in one way or another, because if you leave it up to the landlord, we just talked about how things are kind of a wild, wild west. The landlord is very likely to hire the cheapest person they come across just because they have that fiduciary responsibility to, make money, I guess, on the property and be able to fix the property and make improvements as needed over the years. So when that push comes to shove, or they may have a management company that has that responsibility too, right? You never really know how many players are in the mix here. With that being said, the cheapest person is going to get you the cheapest response, which is going to be there's no problem here, right? Because that's
Sure.
the easiest work for
Yep.
everybody. If the IEP doesn't find a problem, there's no report. They just issue a letter. There's no issue. It's great. They don't have to develop a scope of work. They don't have to talk to a remediator. So, like, these are the pros and cons of this industry. You're going to find the cheapest people. They're going to take one air sample. That one air sample is going to tell them that it's less of a problem than outside. So therefore, there can't be a mold problem because they've been doing it for 20 years. And there you have it, right? So if you hire the inspector, you get to do the due diligence. You get to find somebody that is going to care about the air quality and care about your health because you're the one paying them. You now have that responsibility of finding the person that's going to be right for you. And you'll find out in this wild, wild west search that not everybody, unfortunately, is.
Right.
Um, you'll get control of the process if you figure out a way to pay for that up front. And so I highly recommend figuring that out. Even if you have to borrow money from family or something like that, any attorney will tell you that you need to be the one to have those results so that you have the data that you need to defend yourself. Um, the second thing is once you get that data, you now have an option, right? Am I going to an attorney who's going to help me get out of my lease because the landlord's not doing anything about it? Am I going to present this to the landlord and tell them, I was, having some issues and I got an inspection done and here's what I found. And, I'd like to help you find a good remediator to facilitate this problem. Let me know if you need me to be present to open up for an insurance company. If an insurance company needs to come see what's going on, get involved and take ownership over the process, I think is really key. When I had my ducts replaced, like I, helped find 3 different people to do that. I took responsibility and had set up the appointments for them to come look at it. I made sure that I was following them around and, asking them what they saw and what they thought, and I was gathering the information. Take ownership of the process, I think is really key, because if you don't, you're likely to let someone else take ownership of it. And not everybody is going to have your best interest in mind. You have to advocate for your best interest. So I think it was really important to kind of cover that. If you're looking to get out of your lease, it's finding a reputable attorney that you can afford, that can help you get out of your lease. There's obviously people that may have one reason or another to sue for damages, or there may be things that are just too far gone past of just walking away. And so, finding an attorney that is mold literate, that understands the data that you're presenting, I think is another key part of it.
That's great, because I know I've seen situations where renters, when they don't pay the bill for the IEP, then they don't have rights to the data. And sometimes the landlord or management company will withhold that information. And so you want to have rights to that and own that. Those are great tips. Thank you for that. So if we're going to pick up the phone, we're going to call 3 different remediation companies, what are some key questions we might be asking as we vet these companies? What are we listening for?
So you already have the data at this point, right? So I think a lot of it's going to stem around getting their opinions of the data. That's how I would gauge the person that I wanted to work with. I might ask them things like, what are your thoughts on the scope of work that was presented by the IEP? And you'll be able to gauge someone's personality off of that, right? So you for example may have somebody come in and say like, that's hogwash. I know what to do. I've been doing this for 30 years.
Sure.
I got my own way of doing things, and my way is the best way. And that may be a good indicator of, maybe the person's not going to follow the directions properly and do the work that's required to make you better. I would ask, kind of how they do things. Do they set up engineering controls? What kind of engineering controls? Do they use air scrubbers? Do they put those air scrubbers under negative pressure, right? I might ask, you want to always get them over for some sort of in-person, walkthrough, right, where they prepare an estimate for you. It's a good time to kind of ask some questions about how they may do things. Especially if they're a smaller company, they have a couple people, maybe the estimator is the owner. You get a good feel of how they run things. And when you ask them questions, that the bedroom needs to be remediated, walk them over to the bedroom, ask them how they may, how they plan to handle that. Are they going to set up the engineering controls out that window or that window, and why they chose that window? Where are they going to take the debris out when they're done? And, just get a good sense that they know what they're doing. Ask what they treat with. What are you treating the home with? Are you using bleach or chemicals, or what do you use? Ask if they can provide the safety data sheets for those products. So you can, go scroll down and see if everything in the product is a cancer causing agent that you probably don't want in your house. Yes, believe it or not, the safety data sheets will tell you that certain products have been known to cause cancer, and yet they still make these products. It's mind blowing, but this is where we are. We have all these different, these different things that you can ask for to get a good sense. I think at the end of the day, you gotta feel comfortable, right? You gotta feel comfortable that they care about you and not just about your wallet. And I think that's really important, because if not, then when push comes to shove, when things aren't the way you need them to be, they're very unlikely to be there with you to help you figure out those problems. And so I think you really want to make sure that there's some sort of care factor there, that you feel comfortable with them. I would ask them for some references. I would look at their, Google ratings. I would, do some due diligence on them. Were they recommended by friends and family? Check some of those references. How do they feel about them? What do they like about them? This is another good question that I like to ask when I interview people to work for me. And I ask them to tell me about like one of the worst things that ever happened to them in business and what they did, right? Like ask a company, what was one of the worst, projects that went wrong for you, and what did you do and how did you respond to that? That's a good interview question that I ask, because I want to gauge, am I hiring somebody who has integrity, who's responsible, who's going to care about the clients the way that I would care about them, and making sure that, what we're doing is successful for people. So I think it's really valuable to ask that question. Another interview question that I ask is, what was like one of the best projects you've ever done, and why did it go? Why do you think it went so well? And what did you personally do that made it so, such a great project that made the clients so happy? I would ask that too,
Yeah.
because, as a company, you want to know how cognizant they are of how to be successful, and what makes people happy, and what were their mistakes, and did they learn from their mistakes? And I think it's a really valuable question, because with remediation, it's not finite. It's not like you paint a wall and if you pick the right color, it's going to look great. It's an evolving science. You got to have somebody that really cares and that's determined to make sure that it goes right. Because if laboratory results say that more work is needed, you need to make sure that they're going to help you through that, one way or another. And so I think you have to, really just ask questions that are going to make you feel comfortable, because I've seen so many horror stories where, you read that contract and the contract is pretty elusive, almost on purpose. And when you call them back and say, hey, I need you to, the inspector says you just need to wipe down the area again. It's like, well, no. I don't need to do anything, because according to my contract, the contract's complete. And so you want to make sure that they're going to stick by you through it all.
That's a perfect segue into my next question. What are some of those, they're going to tell you these things, and obviously we want to make sure they're in the contract, but what are some other key things we want to see in writing in our contracts?
What the guarantees are, like what constitutes the contract being complete is the way I look at it. So like the contracts that we have as a company, it very carefully states what exactly you get out of hiring us, right? And I think that's really important, because if there's no clarity there, you're both going to be left at the end with a problem if things don't go the way everybody wanted them to. And so I think you have to clearly define what the outcome is going to be. So if you're reading a contract, and I've seen contracts in the remediation space that would blow your mind. It's like, regardless, like, this is our contract, we're remediators, but also we don't guarantee anything. And if there's still mold there, it's probably not because of us. That's like literally what the language of the contract states. So when you see contracts like that, where they're literally like, you're paying for the scope of work and materials only, and if it doesn't pass, you have to pay us to come back and make it pass. These are the types of things you may want to stay away from, because you may get into this situation where if they don't actually know how to pass, you're paying them forever and you'll never pass, right? So
Right.
I think you have to feel comfortable that the contract states the outcome that you're looking for, and you have to make sure that everyone in the organization that you're dealing with is speaking the same language. You are comfortable that the contract at the end of the day, because of the way it's laid out, you're going to be happy with the final result as long as it's within those realms of the contract. So I think that's really, really important, to make sure that the outcome matches up on the contract with what they're saying.
I love that. I had a friend recently show me a contract, and I kid you not, it said that it only guarantees to pass visual inspection. So, and as you've talked about, this is microscopic. So just a visual assessment of an area just wasn't going quite far enough. She obviously didn't hire them. But I love those questions you pose. Those are really insightful questions beyond just your typical, do you set up containment or whatever. It's going to give you a really good sense of the company and the kind of work you might see. Well, I know we're kind of running out of time here, but I always love to ask this question. What are some key prevention strategies? Because at the end of the day, if you can prevent it, that's going to save you a lot of time, money, and heartache, that you use in your own home to protect your family.
Good. Before I get to that, just to button up this last point,
Sure.
Visual inspections are what's called speculative, right? I could visually see something and say, that's perfect. You might visually see the same thing and be like, that looks like crap, right?
Yeah.
We all have different speculative views. So if you visually speculate that something looks good or doesn't, I think there's just no way to really argue that in court, if you needed to go to court, right? Because he's going to say, he or she's going to say visually that I thought it passed our visual inspection. What's your visual inspection, sir? Well, we look visually if it looks good.
Yeah.
Well, what does good mean? There's all these words that are not clearly defined, right? And so a contract is supposed to be clearly defined. You never, ever, ever look at visual inspection as a means of passing for an outcome. You don't want it to visually look good. That's been the remediation industry for the last 30, 40 years. It visually looks great, so we're good. Yet people are getting sick and staying sick because it's not good. Because we're talking about, again, data. Everything needs to be backed by data. If your company does not back by data, that is not your company.
I love it. And that's why you want to bring in that IEP at the end to do that post testing.
Yes.
And not just take down the containment the same day. As eager as you are to move on from your mold journey, you want to make sure you take the right steps. All right. So how do you keep your family safe? What do you do?
So I have a dehumidifier in every bathroom. Number one. Why? Well, first off, I live in Florida. So for those that don't know, I live in Florida. The humidity is pretty much always high here, maybe except, early spring, late fall. So I need a dehumidifier more often than most folks may. But I think even no matter where you live, sometimes the humidity does get up. And you want to make sure that inside the humidity never creeps up past 60%, where you have an ability for mold to grow at that point. I have these, I forget what they're called. There's like the weather mat the car weather mat company that makes like those weatherproof mats.
Yeah.
They make under the sink. They make under the sink ones of those. So I have one in every vanity in case there's ever a leak, it's going to be less destructive. Although obviously those can fill up and overflow. But the idea is like those small little drips you have here or there, protects against that. I have better filtration in my HVAC. I don't have the MERV 16 here just because I don't own the unit that I am here at this place. So I can't just modify his HVAC unit and install this MERV 16 filter, but I have the highest filtration that I possibly can for this type of unit that doesn't require modification. And I change those more frequently than the average person may. They're supposed to last up to 3 months. I'll tell you, I wouldn't personally go 3 months without changing it because I think at like the 3 month mark, they're going to be pretty gray and disgusting.
Yeah.
So I change them a little more frequently. We have a person that comes in and helps us do a deep cleaning actually every other week. And, we kind of chip in as a family unit to keep the house clean throughout that time period. But that deep cleaning is important. And most people, even if they have a weekly cleaning company, they don't actually do a deeper dive clean. And why that's so important is because we talked earlier about how what's in our environment settles in our dust. And so if we let dust accumulate, especially in places like above the kitchen cabinets that we all forget to clean, you're going to have more opportunity for these particles and toxins to be recirculating into our body. I also have air purifiers, probably more than the average person because people keep sending me things to test. So I have from Molecule to IntelliPure, and I have, essentially almost, I could probably arm each one with one in every room. But I typically, if you have one in every room, it can be pretty loud and noisy.
Yeah.
So I tend to put them in high traffic areas. So for those people, bedrooms in high traffic areas, for those people listening that can't afford a $10,000 air purification thing that has in every room, you would probably want to do it in the bedrooms that you spend the most time in. So your bedroom, if you have kids, your kid's bedroom, maybe living room would be another good one. You don't necessarily need one in every room, especially guest rooms and rooms that you're never in. So just food for thought. You have them in more of the areas you spend a lot of time in. That would be the most suitable to kind of capture a lot of those particles. And by the way, whatever the air purifier is not picking up, you will remove when you do that deep cleaning. So that's why I think Air purification is going to help reduce the amount of cleaning needed, but I think cleaning is really more important. And for those that are on a limited budget, hopefully you like to hear that, because cleaning is takes our time away, but cleaning products are typically inexpensive and can be successful in helping reduce exposure.
You can put on some Change the Air podcast while you vacuum and,
There you go.
learn why you clean. I kind of want to have you back just to talk about the whole cleaning aspect. Do you think you can do a follow-up with us at some point? Because
Sure.
there's a lot to unpack there.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. For anyone listening, be sure to go to our website, changetheairfoundation.org, sign up for our newsletters so you don't miss updates and great information and interviews just like this one. And we'll see you next time.
Ciao. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.